So this week we've been talking about foreign investment and issues of control and interests around the politics of foreign investment policy. I just want to really briefly speak to some of interesting examples that have arisen in Japan over the last decade, in fact just a bit over a neat decade ago, which raises questions about whether the resistance to control events, so we talk about the control of the company, is as much about just a resistance to outsiders as it might be a resistance particularly to foreign outsiders. And so just to flag a few particular instances, very famous instances in the history of corporate governance in the last 20 odd years in Japan, we saw a number of significant developments where Japanese entrepreneurs or Japanese firms launched takeover bids for rivals or other firms in a slightly different sector in the Japanese context. And we saw very significant defensive moves, resistance to those unsolicited takeover bids. One of the most famous was the Fuji Live Door controversy, where a guy called Horie-san, Horiemon in popular parlance, effectively through a complicated process tried to take some part, at least partial or full control of Fuji television group through his own corporate entity, Live Door. He ended up running foul of some rules on what we call front running because he collaborated with some other investors and whatnot. In fact, even did a short stint in prison. But what was particularly interesting in the Fuji Live Door context is not so much those compliance issues, but actually the extent of the resistance to the unsolicited bid from an industry outsider. We saw similarly Rakuten and Mikitani-san with Rakuten at the same time also tried to take a controlling stake in the TBS network, and he in the end didn't get the controlling stake either. In the paper industry, we saw attempts to bring formerly rival companies together, and also in the imaging optics industries, Hoya, the very famous lens-making company, made a move for Pentax and the camera company, and that was extraordinarily complicated, not least because it provoked effectively a civil war amongst the management inside Pentax, and then there was a backlash from the investing community as well, which saw the resistance to Hoya's bid as being driven very much by trying to protect existing managers' interests rather than the interests of shareholders. So we do see to some degree in a Japanese context, a sense of shareholder capitalism. And yet, strikingly, we also see both legal developments and political developments which suggest that a more stakeholder capitalism model is very much considered desirable in a Japanese context. But we need to consider the historical context, particularly in the 2000s, the first decade of the 21st century, when the yen was relatively low. There was a lot of international merger and acquisition activity, and there were a lot of debates about what is the optimal size of a company to be globally competitive. And so we saw in other contexts where there were, for example, in the steel industry, very significant developments with major cross-border acquisitions of companies, say in the French case, for example, and that led to concerns in Japan that maybe some of the great Japanese entities of 20th century manufacturing industrial capability may fall under foreign control. So we saw that a whole bunch of companies put poison pill defenses in place, and I've previously discussed that in another presentation, and you can refer back to that. At the same time, there were quite a lot of market-friendly, by mutual agreement, merger and acquisition activities. Companies are putting themselves together to get larger scale. Sometimes this was about greater efficiencies. Arguably, that's the best reason to do it. But also, there was an argument that if you were larger, you're in a sense less vulnerable to a takeover bid. I'm not sure that really is the case because, of course, finance is so well developed in terms of financing very large acquisitions anyway. But that was the argument. And there are also national champion ideas out there that it was better to put a number of Japanese companies together and build one very strong entity that would compete internationally. And this is a recurrent theme that goes right back to the Meiji period. And if you watch the Tiger drama, for example, featuring Eiichi Shibusawa, you see similar kind of debates right in from the early Meiji period. Now, the poison pill defense thing we've discussed elsewhere, but this critical thing that it would dilute takeover the shareholdings of a potential acquirer who didn't have the agreement of the target board. Effectively, what it does is it issues shares to all the other shareholders and dilutes the shareholding of the potential acquirer. Now, this really came to a head in the Japanese context and was seen very much externally as partly driven by economic nationalism, this defensiveness against foreign takeovers, and particularly foreign investors that were seen to be in it just for the money. So not so much about strategic acquisition, so much as financial plays by investment funds. The criticism centered on one particular investment fund called Steel Partners, which had taken strategic stakes in a number of companies listed here in the slides. Yushiro Soto Brother Industries, very famous for the printers and whatnot, Denki Sangyo, a saw manufacturer, and notably Sapporo Breweries. And they became more active shareholders, wanting to see higher dividends and maybe return of capital to shareholders. And there was a fair degree of resistance to their influence. Now, there were a range of defensive measures put in place by some companies. Some of the Steel Partners proposals were explicitly rejected at shareholders' meetings and whatnot. And so it's quite interesting that management were able actually to mobilize some shareholders in the defense of their own position to vote against Steel Partners, even though some of the propositions that Steel Partners were making would have immediately benefited shareholders. So there are interesting questions about this. Was it nationalism? Was it loyalty to management? Was it a more long-termist orientation? It was much debated. It really came to a head with Steel Partners seeking to take control of the very famous Bulldog Sauce Company. Okay. And Bulldog Sauce put in place a poison pill defense, which Steel Partners then contested legally, and their attempts to have it declared illegal were at all levels of the court rejected. So it was quite significant that the legal precedents that were created laid down some foundations for recognizing that in the Japanese law, poison pill defenses are acceptable. Although some of the judgments were a little bit kind of shaky and created potentially some perverse incentives, and I've touched on this in another video context as well. Most strikingly, in the second court case, Steel Partners was described as an abusive acquirer. And that actually creates an entirely new concept in business terms. What is an abusive acquirer? Is it we buy something in order to smash it, for instance? What was interesting is that newspapers at the time, such as the Yomiuri, very much were critical of the bid. And we see here the editorial in English says from Yomiuri that the bid was, its intrusive attitude towards a company with a history of more than a century was unforgivable. Although Japanese are very quick to say that. It's maybe a rhetorical flourish. At the same time, there was some recognition that ideally companies should be responsible to shareholders. Now, one of the great ironies, of course, is that Bulldog Sauce in the first place took a quintessentially British product, Worcestershire sauce, even with the Bulldog Association, which is a classic symbol of Britain, and for the longest time had been trading in terms of trading on this particular entity, this sauce, and with this association from Britain. And then we had this very nationalistic kind of response against outrageous foreign buyers. What was most striking is that METI, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, was very strongly defensive of these poison pill defense mechanisms, and so we see this in a number of instances, and this is very relevant in terms of debates today. The literature, by the way, and I reference it here from Jensen, shows that generally, yes, poison pills are certainly acceptable in the American context legally, in Delaware, for example, but they generally are very destructive of shareholder value and tend to entrench management and have a very bad reputation in amongst finance academics and amongst finance practitioners. What is particularly interesting in some of the defensive measures against unsolicited takeover bids, whether they're foreign or domestic, but most strikingly in the Fuji Live Door case, for example, there was this very strong argument that all of the stakeholders should be considered. And we see, for example, here, the Yomiuri, in relation to the Rakuten TBS case, said that some deep-pocket investment funds have come under fire for hostile takeover bids that make no concessions to the wishes of their target company's employees and their corporate clients. Now, in the American context, if you're immediately to say, hey, the union's not comfortable with this, that actually would be considered as probably a powerful argument for why the takeover bid should go ahead. The implication would be that management has kind of, been a little bit too soft on entrenched stakeholders in the firm at the expense of shareholders. So this discourse speaks to the notion more of shareholder capitalism. We can unpick some of the issues, though, in a more empathetic kind of way with the Japanese side. One way to think of this is to think actually of core employees as not being, as we would say in the classic finance sense, fully compensated parties, that they've got their salary and they should be just happy with that in return for their work, that actually they have something longer term in stake. And so in a sense, they're a little bit like residual claimants. And we can argue, for example, that the practice of the taishokin, the retirement bonuses and whatnot, there's a great danger that if management did change, then companies might renege on not uphold their promises to employees in terms of retirement benefits and whatnot. And so this is an argument for effectively what we talk about in economics as deferred compensation. That retirement incomes, what we call superannuation arrangements in the Australian or the British context, the ninkin and particularly taishokin and whatnot, are things that the company can renege on, and therefore control issues in the company matters very significantly to labour interests. There's also a broader debate about human resource management in the Japanese context, and this centers on the notion of what one economist from Keio, hugely influential in labour economics in Japan, has referred to as firm-specific human capital. And he tried to explain the major features of Japanese industrial relations, particularly lifetime employment, and ninko joretsu as economically rational, that people had firm-specific skills and they should be rewarded for it. I must say that for the longest time I've been a bit sceptical about this view, because if we think from an economic logic point of view, that if these are skills that are not really transferable to the labour market as a whole, then why would the company need to actually reward the employees for having them in the first place? You only need to pay them marginally more than the general skills that they could sell in the labour market. But that's very much a kind of a market economic logic thing. So I'm not convinced that Koike Sensei has it right in terms of a convincing economic rationale. It may in fact be really true that employees are kind of trapped by having firm-specific skills, and therefore they are a very active voice in terms of governance of the firm because they feel so vulnerable. But that's an argument actually for a certain kind of governance model that may be stakeholder kind of governance model. It's not an argument for a universalist economic rationale that finance economists would be comfortable with, for example. But this leads to some questions. If that's the case, then we might see that core employees are extracting rents, maybe at the expense of casuals and shareholders alike. And that's an ongoing debate. And we would then think in terms of those cross-shareholdings and post-war Japanese capitalism as a mutual defense of core employee arrangements, possibly. I think we can say from what we saw a bit over a decade ago in the Japanese context that there's pretty much this hostility to outsiders of the firm, worried about firms being taken control of by people who are not the insiders, and that those outsiders are equally intimidating even if they're Japanese, not necessarily foreign, although maybe particularly people are coming out of US investment funds, maybe are a little bit scarier. One of the really striking things, and there is a little bit of inconsistency, dare I say, hypocrisy in a Japanese context is that through the 2000s, really since from the late 1990s, but particularly the 2000s and the last 2 decades, we see a significant increase in Japanese outbound FDI. That lots of Japanese companies have been acquiring foreign firms to boost their competitiveness. And we can also see at the same time there's been a lot of voluntary M&A in Japan. It's been a very striking feature. At the same time, inbound FDI, as we've discussed elsewhere, hasn't grown as much. Now, there is an interesting irony in terms of the accepted legal status of the poison pill defense. Because we saw in 2021, very interestingly, Shinsei Bank facing a takeover bid from SBI, the online financial services group, went to put a poison pill defense in place. And at the last minute, when it was supposed to go to the shareholders meeting and they had to actually drop it, and this allowed SBI to effectively then continue with its TOB and take up to about something like 48% of shareholdings and giving it considerable influence. And SBI flagged explicitly that they were looking to actually change the management team at Shinsei. What was interesting there is that the Japanese government itself actually ended up being quite decisive in this, because through its Deposit Insurance Corporation, it is actually a substantial shareholder in the target, in Shinsei Bank. And actually, because that institution had played a really key role, and also with another institution for reconstructing the firm after it went bankrupt did go bankrupt through the bubble and being reinvented then. Subsequently, Shinsei still owes the Japanese government a lot of money. And what is really striking is that the current management and previous management haven't really had a credible plan about how they're actually going to pay back the Japanese government their money. So the last thing the Japanese government wanted was to have it go to a vote where the government itself, as a shareholder, would have to be actually either supporting or opposing a poison pill defense. And so the management withdrew it, and it represented a significant victory for SBI. What's complicated, though, is that the very nature of the SBI bid was actually kind of cheeky, in that it was an offer only to increase the proportion of its shares, not even to a majority, to only about 48%. But in practice, because of the remaining of the diffuse shareholding of the others, would effectively allow it to dominate the board. So it would really get control of the company on the cheap. And some countries actually don't even allow that. That once you actually go over, say, a critical threshold of 19.9%, for example, you're required to launch a takeover bid on a non-exclusive basis. So anyone who wants to sell shares to you. And if you get over 90%, for example, then often there are delisting rules. So it wasn't a particularly desirable governance outcome that we see SBI get such a decisively influential stake in Shinsei through only a partial TOB. At the same time, the poison pill defense was quite brazen. And when the government itself stood to get a not very good deal from this, or damned if you do and damned if you don't, because it's a minority shareholder in another way too, but it's also a major creditor to the bank, then it backed away. So it probably won't prompt a broader discussion in the Japanese context about whether the legal status of poison pills should be revisited or not, but it nonetheless entails certain ironies there. Finally, if we talk in very contemporary terms about thinking of foreign investment issues and control issues and whatnot, something that's gained great salience recently in terms of discourse and explicit policymaking in the Japanese context is this notion of economic security. And governments have made various statements on this, and most active in promoting this notion of economic security is METI. METI has been around for the longest time, acting on behalf supposedly ostensibly of the nation. Okay. And it's got foreign policy issues, but of course foreign policy regulation is through a broader set of laws and historically was enforced through currency controls. That doesn't apply these days. So we tend to either have very explicit caps on foreign equity stakes in certain asset areas, certain industries, and the rest of it is generally a free market for foreign investment. That, of course, has led METI to get very worried that some industries that they see as potentially important for national strategic purposes might fall under foreign control. This manifested in terms of ongoing debates about Toshiba, which has got itself in a troublesome financial position, not least because it spent a lot of money acquiring Westinghouse to become a major global player in nuclear power plant construction and whatnot. But then, of course, after the 3/11 disaster, nuclear power plants are not a very good business, and Toshiba's had a lot of problems in subsequent years. Toshiba, of course, not only because it's in nuclear, but because it has so many other technologies as well. METI has been particularly worried about whether it would come under foreign control, and METI kind of behind the scenes was interfering in recent shareholders' votes, and then there was the company itself, in response to a backlash, commissioned a law firm to do an independent inquiry and revealed some rather embarrassing interference in political interference, effectively from the ministry. But the broader economic security agenda goes beyond foreign investment control. It's supply chain security issues. It's things like rare earths, critical materials, for example, particularly that are sourced from China. It's also very much concerned about intellectual property and protection of intellectual property, and this has been an agenda for more than a decade with the Japanese government. It's had a IP senryaku, IP strategy policy for a while, and it's been wrapped into economic security discourse as well. Also, a growing concern that Japan may be losing its competitive advantage in terms of core technologies, certainly in terms of semiconductors and whatnot in an era of ubiquitous high-speed computing and whatnot. So much of the potency of the discourse around economic security fundamentally comes down to concerns about the rising economic power influence of China. And those issues are not limited, of course, to Japan. Similarly rising in the United States and other countries as well. The restriction of Huawei from participating, for example, in the building of 5G networks, even in my own country, in Australia and in the US, and subsequently more contentiously in the UK and whatnot as well, speaks to those concerns. But economic security has gained a rhetorical or political currency, a policymaking currency in a Japanese context. It is much broader as an agenda than we're seeing it in many other countries. And it's obviously very much championed by METI, who arguably are continuing to deal themselves into the national policymaking process through this. Maybe continuing to find a role for themselves in an era when clearly so much innovation, dynamism is through entrepreneurship, bottom-up, market-driven entrepreneurship, and so the bureaucrats are still trying to find a rationale for themselves as promoters, defenders of the national interest. And so there are some links through Moodle, for example, that you can access that will speak to some of these issues, but generally economists, policy experts are rather wary about the rather nebulous, the rather vague and all catch-all term of economic security, worried that it can be a general excuse for governmental interference in the market in ways that are actually not particularly efficient. And in one reading I've put a link to in Moodle, you see quite significantly the Japanese author there makes the argument that actually, if you're really worried about economic security, what you really need to do is to be focused on the cultural and legal and organizational foundations of entrepreneurship, of innovation, because that's longer term where Japan is likely to be most vulnerable. So there, the broad set of issues. We can see that the debate around economic security and debate around foreign investment taps long-standing concerns. Japan had very closed policy towards foreign investment really until the mid-1980s, and as its own economy was so internationally successful, came under a lot of political pressure from that. And then, with certain limited exceptions, Japan moved towards, on paper, one of the most liberal policies, foreign investment policies around, and yet foreign investment hasn't risen as a percentage of GDP very much, even though in absolute terms it's risen a bit, but still relatively, as we've seen statistically in other contexts in the course, pretty much far and away, not pretty much, far and away, the lowest proportion of, the lowest share of FDI as a proportion of GDP of any of the OECD countries by far. That has given Japan certain advantages, but also very considerable disadvantages as well. So recurrent themes that keep coming back again. My own PhD supervisor, because I wrote my doctoral thesis on the politics of foreign investment regulation, he said to me that these issues are never. You think, okay, that the world has kind of come round to the advantages of a liberal foreign investment policy, but nationalism always arises again. You know, you think you've slayed the dragon, but it gets up again. In the context of the rise of China, we do have an emergent set of issues that we didn't in the past, and readily concede that there are some pretty profound issues of the interdependence of, say, high-tech industries and national security, particularly in an era of ubiquitous connectivity, but also when, particularly under President Xi Jinping, when China quite explicitly articulates a model of its own economic development that is national-centered and explicitly working on different assumptions from what many economists, liberal market economists, have articulated over the last half century and have tried to embed in international institutions. So really the politics of economic security, to use the term, are only going to become more intense over time, and we do really need to engage with those issues.